The rain was coming down in sheets that night, making the roads slick and the visibility poor. I had been driving for hours, heading home from a business trip that had taken me deep into the heart of the Midwest. The clock on my dashboard glowed 2:17 a.m., and the highway was eerily deserted. The only sounds were the hum of my engine and the rhythmic swish of my wipers against the windshield. I remember the sign for Route 66 looming out of the darkness. It was old, weathered, and barely legible in the storm, but it stirred something in me. Route 66, the legendary Mother Road. I decided to take it, hoping to shave some time off my journey and avoid the monotony of the interstate. It didn't take long for the road to feel off. The asphalt seemed darker, the yellow lines faded almost to invisibility. The trees on either side of the highway appeared to lean closer, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead. The storm muffled everything, and the isolation settled on me like a heavy blanket. About 10 miles in, my headlights caught someone, standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a woman, drenched from the rain, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she had one hand raised, signaling for help. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the desperation in her eyes. I pulled over, rolling down the passenger window just enough to hear her. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Can you take me to the diner up the road? It's not far." Her words sent a chill through me, but I nodded. I unlocked the door and she climbed in, dripping water onto the seat. She didn't say much, just gave me vague directions. The smell of wet earth and something metallic filled the car. We drove in silence for a while, the tension growing thicker with each passing mile. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "So," I began, trying to sound casual, "what were you doing out there?" She turned to me slowly, her pale face illuminated by the dashboard's glow. Her eyes were dark, empty, like looking into a bottomless well. "Waiting," she said simply. "For what?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "For you," she replied, and then she smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent my heart racing. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was spinning. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. We passed a mile marker, and I realized I hadn't seen another car, another building, another sign of life in miles. It was just us, the storm, and this endless stretch of haunted highway. Finally, the diner came into view, a shabby, neon-lit relic that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The woman leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the building. "Here," she said. "This is the place." I pulled into the gravel lot, my tires crunching over the rocks. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering in the rain. I turned to her, ready to ask if she was sure, but the words caught in my throat. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, completely dry, as if no one had been sitting there at all. My breath hitched, and I scrambled out of the car, my shoes sinking into the muddy ground. I ran to the diner, its windows dark and cracked, and peered inside. The interior was frozen in time, tables set with dusty plates and cups, a jukebox in the corner coated with grime. But it was deserted. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A photograph hanging on the wall near the door. It was old, black and white, and showed a group of people standing in front of the diner. My blood ran cold as I recognized her, the woman I had picked up. She was smiling faintly, standing next to a man in a mechanic's uniform. The date scrawled on the bottom of the photo read 1957. I stumbled back to my car, shaking and drenched, and floored it out of there. The highway stretched on forever, and no matter how far I drove, the diner's neon sign kept appearing in my rearview mirror, flickering and buzzing like a phantom. The storm finally broke, just as dawn began to creep over the horizon. When I saw the sign for the interstate, I veered onto it without hesitation, leaving Route 66 and its cursed stretch of road behind. But here's the thing. When I finally got home, I found something on the passenger seat. It was small, cold, and metallic. A rusted key with a tiny tag attached that read Table 7.
Story number 2.
The night was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rumble of my old truck on the uneven pavement. I was driving home from my friend's wedding, a good 3-hour trip through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. I chose the scenic route to avoid tolls and traffic, but by midnight, I was starting to regret it. The GPS on my phone had stopped working miles ago, and the trees lining the highway seemed to press in closer with each passing mile. The sign for Old Mill Road flickered under my headlights as I made a left turn. The road was narrow and winding, the asphalt cracked and riddled with potholes. My instincts told me to turn around, but there was something oddly compelling about this route, like the road itself was inviting me deeper. It was then that I saw him. A man was standing on the shoulder of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a black suit that looked like it had been pulled from another era. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, there was something hollow about them, as though they were looking through me rather than at me. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, just beyond the reach of my headlights, were more figures. Dozens of them, standing in the shadows, their faces indistinct but their presence unmistakable. My chest tightened, every rational part of me screamed to keep driving, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The man raised one skeletal hand and pointed down the road. It was a deliberate, almost mechanical gesture, and though he didn't speak, the message was clear. Keep going. Swallowing hard, I pressed down on the gas and drove past him. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, the figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching, until the darkness swallowed them again. The road stretched on, twisting and turning with no end in sight. The forest on either side grew denser, the trees gnarled and ancient. It felt as though I was driving into a tunnel, the world outside completely forgotten. The air in the truck grew thick and heavy, and an unshakable sense of dread settled over me. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, harsh and grating, but beneath it, I could hear something else, a voice, faint and distorted. "Turn around," it whispered. "You're not supposed to be here." My hands trembled as I reached for the knob to turn it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Turn around. They're waiting." I slammed my fist against the radio and the static cut out abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. I tried to convince myself it was just the radio picking up some stray frequency, but deep down, I knew better. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 1:13 a.m. I had been driving for what felt like hours, yet the time hadn't changed. My heart pounded as I checked my phone. It was dead, the battery drained despite being fully charged when I started the trip. The first sign of real panic set in when I saw the bridge. It loomed ahead, an old iron monstrosity that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The wooden planks beneath the metal frame were rotted and uneven, and a thin layer of fog clung to its surface. There was no way my truck could cross it safely. I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights casting long shadows across the bridge. That's when I saw her. A little girl stood in the middle of the bridge, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair was matted, and her face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, waiting. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed to the other side of the bridge. I shook my head, backing away from the edge. "I can't cross that. It's not safe." Her hand dropped to her side, and for a moment, she was still. Then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across her face. Her teeth were sharp, glinting in the dim light. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I jumped back into my truck, threw it into reverse, and sped back the way I had come. The road seemed different now, the turns sharper and more disorienting. My headlights flickered, and the forest around me felt alive, shifting and closing in. And then I saw them again. The figures were back, standing in the middle of the road this time, blocking my path. The man in the black suit stood at the front, his hollow eyes locked on mine. Behind him, the others swayed gently, as though moved by an unseen wind. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. The truck came to a stop mere feet from the man, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing right at the hood of my truck. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. He raised his hand again, pointing back the way I had come. "Go back!" His voice echoed in my head, though his lips never moved. "You can't leave." My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Desperation overtook me, and I threw the truck into drive, swerving off the road and onto the shoulder to avoid him. The figures parted as I sped past, their faces blank and emotionless. The road blurred as I drove faster than I ever had before. I didn't care about the potholes or the cracks. I just needed to get out. The clock on the dashboard still read 1:13 a.m., but the first faint rays of dawn began to creep through the trees. When I finally saw the sign for the interstate, I nearly cried. I veered onto the exit ramp. the smooth pavement a welcome relief under my tires. The figures were gone, the oppressive weight lifted, but the memory of their hollow eyes lingered. I never found Old Mill Road on any map, and I've never taken the back roads since. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear the static from the radio and the whisper of that voice. Turn around. You're not supposed to be here.
Story number 3.
The night was heavy with mist, the kind that clings to the ground and swallows everything it touches. I was on a late-night drive, returning home after a long day of visiting a friend in a small, secluded town in northern Ohio. The road stretched endlessly before me, flanked by towering cornfields that seemed to sway despite the absence of wind. It was the kind of darkness that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. My car's headlights barely cut through the fog, creating an eerie tunnel of light that seemed to trap me in its glow. The clock on my dashboard read 12:47 a.m. As I drove, I noticed a wooden sign by the roadside, its paint peeling and letters faded. Dead Man's Hollow, 2 miles. I shivered despite the warmth of the car. The name struck a chord in me, dredging up a vague memory from some childhood ghost story. I shook it off, trying to focus on the road ahead. That's when the radio turned on by itself. At first, it was just static, a soft crackle that could have been a glitch. But then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. "Turn back," it whispered. My stomach tightened. I reached for the dial, but before I could touch it, the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Turn back now. It's waiting." The car jerked slightly as if I'd hit a bump, though the road was smooth. My heart pounded as I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to get away from whatever this was. The voice faded, replaced by the monotonous hum of my tires on the asphalt. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, behind me, but there was only the mist and the empty road. The cornfields gave way to a dense forest, the trees gnarled and ancient, their branches twisted together above the road, creating a canopy that blocked out the faint moonlight. The darkness seemed thicker here, more oppressive. My headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement, as the car came to a halt mere feet from the figure. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes that looked soaked and torn, as if he'd been out in the rain for days. His head hung low, his face obscured by a mop of unkempt hair. He didn't move, didn't react to my presence. I honked the horn, but he stayed still like a statue carved from shadow. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I rolled down the window just enough to call out to him. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The man slowly raised his head, and my blood turned to ice. His eyes were pitch black, voids that seemed to pull at the edges of my sanity. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the radio crackled to life again. "It's waiting," the voice hissed. "Go to the bridge." The man pointed down the road, his skeletal finger trembling. I didn't want to follow his direction, but something in his gaze held me captive, compelling me to obey. My foot pressed lightly on the gas, and the car inched forward, the figure disappearing into the darkness as I passed. The forest grew thicker, the road narrower. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but the road was too tight for a U-turn, and the voice on the radio echoed in my mind. Finally, the trees parted, and I saw it. The bridge. It was old and decaying, its wooden planks warped and splintered. Rusted chains hung limply from the sides, and the air around it felt wrong. A chill swept through the car, despite the heater running full blast. The fog thickened, swirling like living tendrils around the structure. I stopped the car at the edge of the bridge, my headlights illuminating the rotting wood. The river below was black and still, reflecting nothing but the pale mist above it. The radio crackled again, and the voice returned. "You have to cross. It's waiting for you." My heart raced. I didn't want to cross that bridge. Every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea, but the pull was undeniable. My hands moved of their own accord, shifting the car into drive and easing it onto the planks. The boards groaned under the weight of the car, and I could feel every creak vibrate through the frame. Halfway across, the headlights began to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows. I glanced at the river below and froze. There was something in the water. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A pale face just below the surface, its eyes wide and unblinking. More faces emerged, dozens of them, staring up at me with expressions of agony and despair. A sudden thud on the roof of the car made me jump. My breath hitched as I heard the unmistakable sound of something clawing at the metal. The scratches were slow and deliberate, like whatever was up there wanted me to know it was in no hurry. "Keep going," the voice on the radio urged. "You're almost there." I pressed down on the gas, desperate to get off the bridge. The clawing grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing on the roof was angry that I was leaving. The faces in the water followed my car, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. When I finally reached the other side, the sound stopped. The car shuddered as if something heavy had leapt off the roof. I didn't dare look back. The road ahead was clear, the forest thinning out into open fields. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The radio crackled one last time. "You've been marked," the voice said. "It will find you again." I drove straight home, the memory of the bridge haunting me with every mile. When I pulled into my driveway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Exhausted, I stumbled inside and collapsed on the couch. It wasn't until later that morning, when I went back to retrieve something from my car, that I noticed it. Scratched into the hood, deep and jagged, were 3 words: "It's still waiting."
Story number 4.
The wind was howling that night, a mournful wail that rattled the windows of my car as I navigated the desolate stretch of Highway 491. Locals called it the Devil's Highway, and for good reason. It had a dark reputation, a place where accidents were common, where drivers vanished without a trace. I didn't believe in those stories, of course, at least not until that night. I was heading south, trying to make it to my sister's house before midnight. The GPS had suggested this route as a shortcut, though I now wondered if it had been a mistake. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by barren desert. The moon was a faint blur behind heavy clouds, and the only light came from my high beams, which barely pierced the inky darkness. Then I saw it. A truck appeared in my rearview mirror, its headlights glaring like twin suns. It was gaining on me fast. I stayed in my lane, expecting it to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed right on my bumper. So close I could practically hear the growl of its engine over the wind. Annoyed, I tapped my brakes lightly, a warning to back off. The truck swerved violently in response, almost as if it had tried to ram me. My heart raced, and I tightened my grip on the wheel. This wasn't just a reckless driver. Something was wrong. The truck's horn blared, long and shrill, and it flashed its high beams. The light flooded my car, blinding me momentarily. When I glanced into the mirror again, I caught a glimpse of the driver. Or rather, what should have been the driver. There was no one behind the wheel. My blood turned to ice. The truck's headlights bore down on me, and I floored the gas, trying to put some distance between us. My little sedan wasn't built for speed, but I pushed it to its limits, the engine whining in protest. The truck followed. No matter how fast I went, it stayed right behind me, and its horn blaring intermittently. The road seemed endless, the desert around me stretching out in a cruel, featureless void. Panic clawed at my chest as the truck edged closer, its grille almost touching my bumper. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck veered off the road and vanished into the darkness. I gasped for air, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I didn't dare slow down. I just needed to get off this cursed highway. A few miles later, I saw a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign a beacon of hope. I pulled in and parked under the dim canopy of lights, my entire body shaking. The station looked old, almost abandoned, but I didn't care. I needed a break, a moment to catch my breath. Inside, the air was stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The clerk, an older man with a weathered face, looked up from his magazine as I approached the counter. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. I hesitated, then blurted out everything. The truck, the driverless cab, the way it had chased me. His expression darkened as I spoke. "You were on 491, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're lucky you made it here. Most people who run into that truck don't." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "That truck's been haunting this highway for decades. Some say it's the ghost of a long-haul driver who died in a wreck out here, fell asleep at the wheel and went off the road. Others think it's something worse. Either way, it's not natural." A chill ran down my spine. "Why does it chase people?" The clerk shrugged. "Some say it's looking for revenge. Others think it just wants to drag people to the same fate it suffered." He paused, his gaze piercing. "But once you see it, it doesn't just go away." My stomach sank. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer, just handed me my change and muttered, Be careful out there. I left the gas station feeling more uneasy than ever. The clerk's words replayed in my head as I got back on the road. I kept my speed steady, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the horizon ahead. The highway was empty, the night oppressive. But then I saw it again. Far in the distance, headlights appeared, faint but unmistakable. They grew brighter, closer, faster than seemed possible. My chest tightened and my hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It was the truck. This time it didn't wait. It roared toward me, its horn blaring, its headlights like twin spotlights bearing down. I swerved onto the shoulder just in time to avoid it, my tires kicking up gravel. The truck didn't stop. It barreled past, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I sat there for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. The truck was gone, but the terror it left behind lingered. I took a deep breath and eased back onto the road, determined to get as far away as possible. But it wasn't over. The truck appeared again, this time coming up fast in my rearview mirror. It swerved violently, its horn blaring, and I knew it wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to run me off the road. I swerved to avoid it, my tires screeching as I barely held control. The truck loomed closer and I realized there was no escaping it. My mind raced, searching for a way out. And then I saw it. An old dirt road branching off the highway. Without thinking, I turned sharply onto it, the truck's horn echoing behind me as I left the highway. The dirt road was rough, the car jolting with every bump and pothole. The truck didn't follow. I drove until I reached a clearing, my headlights illuminating a small, overgrown cemetery. I stopped the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The nightmare of the night seemed to fade with the rising sun, but the unease never left me. To this day, I avoid Highway 491. I've heard stories from others who've encountered the truck, their tales eerily similar to mine. Some say the truck still haunts the road, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the roads are empty, I swear I can still hear the blare of its horn in the distance.
Story number 5.
The road was eerily quiet that night. I had just finished a late shift at the diner and was heading home along Route 66, a stretch of highway known more for its legends than its traffic. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. My old Chevy rattled over the cracked pavement, its headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. There was no moon, no stars, just the faint glow of my headlights reflecting off the cracked asphalt and the occasional tumbleweeds skittering across the road. Then I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, just outside the range of my high beams, a woman in a tattered white dress, barefoot, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders. She didn't wave or step forward, just stood there, staring. My chest tightened as I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. Picking up hitchhikers was something I avoided, but leaving her alone in the middle of nowhere felt worse. Against my better judgment, I rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of her and leaned out the window. "Need a ride?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. She didn't answer, just tilted her head in a bird-like manner, her eyes locking onto mine. Something about her gaze made my stomach churn, but I forced a smile and motioned for her to come closer. She stepped forward silently, her feet making no sound on the gravel. When she reached the car, she slid into the passenger seat without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. Up close, she looked even stranger. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, there was something off about them. They were too dark, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the cabin. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She turned to look at me, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. The air in the car felt heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. "Okay," I muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Well, I'm going as far as Jasper. I can drop you off there." She nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, and turned to face the windshield. I noticed then that her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers unnaturally long and thin. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, fighting the urge to glance at her again. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though the clock had barely moved. The darkness outside seemed to press against the car, thick and suffocating. The radio, which had been playing a soft hum of static, crackled to life. "You shouldn't have stopped," a voice whispered through the speakers. I nearly slammed on the brakes. The voice wasn't mine. and it wasn't hers. It was deep, gravelly, and filled with a malice that sent chills down my spine. I glanced at her, but she didn't react. She just stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. The radio crackled again, the static rising and falling like a ragged breath. She's not what she seems. My heart pounded as I reached for the knob to turn it off, but the moment my fingers touched the dial, the voice growled, "Don't." I jerked my hand back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The woman turned to me then, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. Her eyes bore into mine, and for the first time she spoke. "Don't listen to it." Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but it only heightened my fear. I pressed down on the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there. The speedometer climbed, but the road ahead remained the same, a long, unbroken stretch of black asphalt. The radio crackled once more, louder this time. The voice sounded strained, as though it were struggling to push through the static. "Turn around," it demanded. "Turn around now." "Why?" I asked aloud, my voice shaking. "What's going on?" The woman's expression darkened, and for the first time I saw something shift in her face, something that wasn't human. Her lips curled into a smile, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth that hadn't been there before. "Because," the voice on the radio growled, "you've picked up a passenger who never left." My blood ran cold. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The woman didn't flinch, didn't move, but her smile widened, stretching impossibly far. "What are you?" I whispered. She leaned in close, her face inches from mine, and for the first time I saw her true form. Her skin cracked like old porcelain, revealing a black, oozing void beneath. Her eyes burned like twin coals, and her breath smelled of decay. "I'm what waits on the road," she hissed. "I'm what you invited in." Before I could react, she lunged at me. Her hands were cold as death, her grip like iron as she clawed at my arms. I screamed, fumbling for the door handle, but the cabin seemed to shrink, trapping me inside. The radio blared, the static rising to a deafening roar. "Get out!" the voice bellowed. "Now!" With a surge of adrenaline, I yanked the door open and tumbled out onto the pavement. The night air was freezing, biting at my skin as I scrambled to my feet. The woman, or whatever she was, remained in the car, her twisted face pressed against the window, watching me with an expression of pure malice. The car's headlights flickered, and for a moment I thought she might come after me. But then, without warning, the engine roared to life. The car sped off into the darkness, her laughter echoing behind it. I stood there, shaking, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The highway was silent once more, the oppressive darkness returning as if nothing had ever disturbed it. When I finally gathered the courage to walk, I stuck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the horizon. Hours later, I reached a truck stop, my clothes dirty and my legs aching. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside. "Car trouble?" he asked. I shook my head, too exhausted to explain. All I could manage was, "Don't stop for anyone on Route 66. His face paled, and he nodded slowly as if he understood more than he let on. To this day, I don't drive at night, and I never ever stop for strangers.
Story number 6.
The night was cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was driving back from a late shift on a remote stretch of Highway 378, a road infamous in the area for its strange occurrences. Most people avoided it at night, but I was too tired to take the longer route. The road was flanked by dense pine trees, their silhouettes looming like shadowy sentinels under the pale light of the moon. My headlights illuminated only a narrow patch of the road ahead, and the world beyond seemed to dissolve into an impenetrable darkness. I had just passed the halfway point when I noticed something unusual. A red glow, faint but growing stronger, appeared on the horizon. At first thought it might be taillights from another car, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It hovered, flickering slightly, like a flame caught in the wind. I slowed down, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. As I approached, the glow took form. It was a fire, burning low in the middle of the road. Around it stood 3 figures, cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden in shadow. Every instinct told me to turn around, but the road was too narrow, and the forest too thick for me to maneuver off the shoulder. Heart pounding, I rolled to a stop a few yards away from the fire. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge my car. They just stood there, their heads tilted downward as if in prayer, or something darker. I honked the horn, the sound shattering the eerie stillness. The figures turned in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow pits that seemed to suck the light from the fire. One of them raised an arm and pointed at me. That was enough. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up. The fire flared suddenly, its flames turning a vivid, unnatural green. Shadows danced wildly around the figures, stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. The car's engine sputtered and the headlights flickered. Panic surged through me as I shifted into drive, slamming the gas pedal. The car surged forward and I swerved around the fire, narrowly missing the cloaked figures. My rearview mirror showed them standing motionless, their empty eyes following me as I sped away. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The road stretched empty before me, the oppressive silence broken only by the hum of the engine. But then the car began to shudder. The dashboard lights blinked erratically, and the engine's hum turned into a strained whine. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was full. Whatever was happening wasn't mechanical. The headlights dimmed, and the darkness closed in like a living thing. I pressed harder on the gas, but the car slowed, as if something were pulling it back. In the mirror, the red glow of the fire reappeared, far too close for the distance I had driven. My heart raced as the glow intensified, and then I saw them. The three figures were running, their cloaks billowing like shadows in the wind. But it wasn't their speed that terrified me. It was how they ran. Jerky, unnatural movements like puppets on invisible strings. "Come on, come on!" I muttered, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The car roared to life, the headlights flaring brightly, and I shot forward, putting as much distance as I could between me and those things. Minutes passed in a blur, the forest whipping by on either side. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel, and sweat dripped down my face despite the cold. The red glow faded in the mirror, and I began to think I'd escaped. Then I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the roof of the car. It was soft at first, utterly almost imperceptible over the sound of the tires on the asphalt. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady, rhythmic pounding. I didn't dare look up. My eyes stayed glued to the road, my hands shaking as I fought to keep the car steady. The tapping stopped suddenly, and for a brief, hopeful moment, I thought it was over. But then a face appeared in the passenger window. I screamed, nearly losing control of the car. The face was one of the cloaked figures, its hollow eyes staring directly into mine. Its skin was ashen and cracked, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I couldn't understand how it was keeping up with the car, but it didn't matter. All I wanted was to get away. The figure's hands slapped against the glass, leaving a smear of black ichor that seemed to sizzle and steam. I swerved wildly, trying to shake it off, and the car skidded onto the shoulder. The figure disappeared, and I hit the brakes, the car coming to a jerking stop. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sat there, gripping the wheel. The silence returned, heavier than before. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, the side mirrors, the trees beyond the road. Nothing. And then the laughter began. It was low at first, a guttural chuckle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It grew louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were joining in. My hands fumbled for the gear shift, and I slammed the car into drive, the tires spinning on the gravel before finding traction. I drove like a madman, the laughter fading but never disappearing entirely. The road twisted and turned, the trees thinning as I neared the edge of the forest. Relief flooded me as I saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot and jumped out of the car, my legs shaking. The attendant, a young man with a puzzled expression, stepped out from behind the counter. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing me warily. I nodded, though I was anything but. "Can I use your phone?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Sure," he said, motioning toward the counter. As I headed inside, he glanced at my car and froze. "Hey, what's that on your roof?" My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my eyes following his gaze. Black handprints were smeared across the roof of my car, each one dripping with a tar-like substance that hissed and bubbled as it slid down the windows. I didn't stay to explain. I drove straight home, the image of those handprints burned into my mind. For weeks, I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, every time I drive at night, I catch myself glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see that red glow again. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the faint echo of their laughter.
Story number 7.
The night I encountered him on Hollow Ridge Road still haunts my every dream. It was supposed to be a simple drive home, like any other, but that night became something far worse. Something I'll never forget. I had been at a friend's party a few towns over, and by the time I left, it was well past midnight. Hollow Ridge Road was infamous in our area for being dangerous, not just because of its sharp turns and dense woods, but because of the stories. Everyone had heard the legends. Tales of ghostly hitchhikers, shadowy figures darting across the road, and a man they called the Watcher. I never believed in any of it, though. At least, not until that night. The road was empty, as expected, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against my headlights like a living thing. The trees towered on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. My playlist hummed softly in the background, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. About halfway through the drive, I saw him, a man standing on the shoulder of the road, his back turned to me. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned coat, the tails of it swaying slightly in the breeze. His hat, a wide-brimmed thing, cast a shadow over his head, making him appear faceless. I slowed down instinctively, but something about him made my skin crawl. "Keep driving," I whispered to myself, my fingers tightening on the wheel. And I did, though I couldn't stop my eyes from flicking to the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing perfectly still, his head now turned slightly as if watching me leave. The moment I rounded the next bend, my headlights illuminated something that made my stomach drop. There he was again, standing in the middle of the road, his silhouette sharp against the blackness. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. No side roads, no shortcuts, just the same endless stretch of highway. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt just feet from him. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, head cocked as if listening for something. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Get out of the road!" No response. My headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across his figure. Then, slowly, he turned to face me, his movements unnatural, jerky. I still couldn't see his face, just an endless void beneath that hat. Adrenaline surged through me as I threw the car into reverse, my tires skidding on the asphalt. The man began to walk toward me, his steps slow and deliberate, each one echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. My car suddenly stalled, the engine sputtering and dying as if it had been snuffed out by an unseen force. I frantically turned the key in the ignition, but it wouldn't start. The man was closer now, his long strides closing the distance far too quickly. His arms hung unnaturally at his sides, his fingers impossibly long and thin, twitching as he walked. Come on," I muttered, my voice cracking as I tried the ignition again. The car roared back to life just as he reached the hood. I didn't think. I just hit the gas, swerving wildly to avoid him. My tires screamed as I sped past, and in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, his head tilted, his hat falling to the ground. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was wrong. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over bone. I drove as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road seemed endless, the darkness pressing closer with every passing second. My headlights flickered again, and the radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. "Why didn't you stop?" a voice whispered, low and distorted, like it was coming from the depths of a cave. I turned the dial, trying to shut it off, but the voice persisted. "He's always watching. You can't escape." The car shuddered violently, and suddenly I felt something cold, freezing like ice, brush against the back of my neck. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but the air was heavy, suffocating, as if someone or something was there. I kept driving, refusing to look back again. The road twisted and turned, the trees blurring together in a dizzying haze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of a small diner up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the parking lot, skidding to a stop. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaking, and ran inside. The diner was empty, except for the waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a cigarette dangling from her lips. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, eyeing me as I collapsed into a booth. "I don't know what I saw," I stammered, my voice barely audible. "There was a man on the road. He followed me." Her expression darkened. She set down the coffee pot she was holding and leaned against the counter. "Hollow Ridge Road?" she asked. I nodded, my heart still racing. She sighed, shaking her head. "You're not the first. People say he's been haunting that road for decades. They call him the Watcher. Some say he's the spirit of a drifter who was hit by a car back in the 50s. Others think he's something older, something that's always been there. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Has anyone ever gotten away? She didn't answer, just slid a cup of coffee in front of me. Best thing you can do is avoid that road, she said softly. Once he's marked you, though, well, you might not have a choice. Her words chilled me to the core. I sat there for hours, too afraid to get back in the car. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, the parking lot was empty. My car, the only vehicle in sight. As I climbed back behind the wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The back seat was still empty, but in the faint reflection of the rear window, I saw him standing at the edge of the lot, his hat back on his head, his hollow gaze fixed on me. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I floored it, speeding out of the lot and onto the highway, vowing never to drive Hollow Ridge Road again. But sometimes late at night, I feel that same icy chill on the back of my neck, and I know he's still watching.
Story number 8.
It was the night of my cousin Danny's wedding, and I had stayed at the reception longer than planned. By the time I left, it was nearly 2 a.m., and the thought of the long drive back to my small town weighed heavily on me. I debated crashing at a nearby hotel, but I didn't want to spend money. So I decided to take the back roads home to avoid traffic and save time. That was my first mistake. The back roads were infamous in our area. They cut through miles of farmland and woods, and more than one local swore up and down they were haunted. Stories of strange lights, shadowy figures, and phantom cars filled the town lore. I never believed any of it. I wasn't the superstitious type, and ghost stories were just that, stories. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. My headlights sliced through the dark, illuminating stretches of cracked asphalt and looming trees. The occasional mailbox appeared on the roadside, but otherwise it was just me and the night. The air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I had just passed an old, abandoned farmhouse when the strange things began. It started with a thud, a loud, echoing sound from under the car. Startled, I slowed down and pulled over. I climbed out, expecting to find that I'd hit an animal or driven over debris. But the road was empty, and the underside of the car looked fine. As I stood there, the silence seemed different, too quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. Shrugging off the unease, I got back in the car and drove on, my fingers gripping the wheel a little tighter. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing dead center in the middle of the road. My stomach twisted as I squinted into the darkness. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, too rigid, too still, made my skin crawl. I slowed to a crawl, unsure of what to do. As I got closer, I could see the figure was wearing tattered clothes, their face hidden by a mess of long, unkempt hair. I rolled down the window just slightly, enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. They didn't move. The longer I stared, the more wrong everything felt. My instincts screamed at me to drive around them and not stop. But before I could make up my mind, the figure's head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw their face, or lack of one. It was blank. Smooth, pale skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. My breath hitched as the figure took a single step forward, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a broken marionette. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the gas. The car lurched forward, and I swerved around the figure, narrowly missing them. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. The figure was gone. For the next few miles, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see them again. My heart pounded, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the darkness. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a prank, a mask, some teenager messing around. But deep down, I knew better. The air felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then the radio cut on. I nearly jumped out of my seat. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and jarring. I twisted the dial, trying to turn it off, but the volume only grew louder. The static crackled, and beneath it, I heard a faint voice. "Don't look back." The words sent a chill racing down my spine. My heart hammered as I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to look away, something moved. It was a shadow, tall and thin, standing on the side of the road. My headlights didn't catch it. It was only visible in the mirror. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The shadow was following me. It moved with an unnatural speed, keeping pace with my car without ever breaking into a run. Its shape seemed to shift and stretch, like it was made of smoke. I pressed the gas harder, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its limit. The shadow moved closer. I could feel it now, an icy chill seeping into the car despite the windows being rolled up. My breath fogged the windshield, and the radio blared with static and distorted whispers. "Don't stop," the voice said again, barely audible beneath the noise. I drove faster than I ever had before, my focus entirely on the road. But no matter how far I went, the shadow stayed with me, always in the mirror, always just behind me. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of a gas station up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I raced toward the lights, the car skidding to a stop in the empty lot. I jumped out, my legs shaking, and ran inside. The attendant, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked up from his magazine. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing me warily. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pointed toward the road. "Something's following me." He frowned and stepped around the counter, peering outside. The lot was empty. The road was empty. "There's nothing out there," he said. I shook my head, my heart still racing. It was there. I saw it. The attendant sighed and reached for a pack of cigarettes. "You're not the first to say that," he muttered, lighting one up. "Lots of people see things on that stretch of road. You're lucky you made it here." His words did little to comfort me. I sat in the gas station for over an hour, too afraid to leave. When I finally worked up the courage to get back in the car, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the empty road. The drive home was quiet, almost peaceful. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes when I check my rearview mirror, I think I see it, the shadow, just for a split second, before it vanishes. And every time I hear static on the radio, I turn it off because I know what it's going to say. Don't look back.
Story number 9.
The night I found myself on Lonesome Pines Highway still lingers in my mind like a scar. It was one of those nights where everything feels just slightly off. Too quiet, too cold. I'd taken the highway to avoid the congested main roads after a long shift. It was supposed to save me time, but instead it cost me something far greater, my peace of mind. The highway earned its name from its eerie isolation. It stretched for miles through dense forests with no streetlights, no houses, just darkness. I'd driven it a few times before, but always during the day. At night, it was an entirely different beast. It began innocuously enough. The hum of my tires against the asphalt was the only sound accompanying me as I navigated the winding road. My car's high beams barely pierced the thick shroud of night, and the trees seemed to close in on me the further I went. About halfway through the drive, I noticed the first strange thing, a flickering light in the distance. At first, I thought it might be a motorcycle or an old car with a faulty headlight, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't on the road at all. It was in the trees. The light bobbed and swayed, like a lantern being carried by an invisible hand. It moved parallel to my car, keeping pace no matter how fast or slow I drove. I told myself it was just someone out night hiking, even though the idea felt absurd. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? The light vanished as abruptly as it appeared, leaving me alone once again. My relief was short-lived. About a mile down the road, I saw something else. A figure standing on the shoulder just at the edge of my high beams. It was a woman, at least I thought it was. She wore a long white dress that looked outdated, like something from the early 1900s. Her hair hung in damp strands over her face, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep driving, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slowed the car and rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening, but that was it. The longer I looked at her, the more unnatural she seemed. Her dress wasn't just white, it was glowing faintly, as though it had absorbed the moonlight. Then she started walking toward the car. Her movements were stiff and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through me, and I hit the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was in the middle of the road, standing perfectly still, her head now turned in my direction. Even as I rounded a curve, her glowing figure remained visible, like a ghost burned into my vision. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. But the unease in my chest only grew. The road ahead seemed darker than before, and my headlights began to flicker, casting erratic shadows across the trees. Then my radio turned on by itself. Static hissed from the speakers, loud and jarring. I fumbled with the knobs, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. Beneath the static, I could hear something else. A voice, faint and distant, like someone calling out from deep underwater. "Help me." The voice sent a chill down my spine. It was distorted, broken, but unmistakably female. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept driving, refusing to look at the radio or the mirrors. The voice grew louder, more urgent. "Help me, please." "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." Suddenly, the static cut out, replaced by silence. But the relief was fleeting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I glanced at the passenger seat and nearly swerved off the road. She was sitting there, the woman in the white dress. Her hair hung over her face, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her presence filled the car with a cold so intense that I could see my breath. I screamed, jerking the wheel to the side, but she didn't react. She just sat there, motionless. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of my car!" Her head turned slowly toward me, her hair parting just enough to reveal her face, or what should have been her face. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. When I turned to look at her again, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as though she'd never been there. I sat there for a long moment, my chest heaving, my mind racing. I wanted to turn around to go back the way I came, but the thought of driving through that darkness again was unbearable. So I pressed on, praying that the nightmare was over. It wasn't. A few miles later, I saw the flickering light again, this time directly in front of me. It hovered in the middle of the road, swaying gently. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to turn back, but before I could make a decision, the light rushed toward me. It wasn't a lantern. It was her. She hurtled toward the car, her glowing figure blindingly bright. I screamed and swerved, the tires screeching as I lost control. The car veered off the road and slammed into a tree, the impact knocking the breath out of me. When I opened my eyes, everything was still. The engine had died, and the headlights barely illuminated the dense woods around me. Blood trickled down my forehead, and my hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone. It was dead. A soft tapping sound drew my attention to the window. My heart stopped. She was there, crouched just outside, her featureless face pressed against the glass. Her hands clawed at the window, leaving streaks of frost in their wake. "Help me," her voice whispered, muffled but clear. "Help me." I scrambled out of the car, stumbling into the darkness. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to get away. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in on me from all sides. Her voice followed me, echoing through the night. "Help me. Don't leave me." Finally, I saw a faint light through the trees. I ran toward it, bursting into a clearing where a small cabin stood. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. An old man answered, his face lined with age and concern. "You came from the highway, didn't you?" he asked, his voice grim. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed and pulled me inside, locking the door behind me. "She's been haunting these roads for decades," he said. "Died in a car crash back in the 50s. They say she's looking for someone to take her place." I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, the old man drove me to the nearest town. I never went back to Lonesome Pines Highway, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice in my dreams, soft and pleading.